Resource and Environmental Management at the Energy Materials Research Group. So my senior supervisor is Mark Jackard, and my talk today will be based on his public talk presentations. And I'm going to talk about why we consistently fail to address climate change and what can be done to ensure effective climate change mitigation. So first of all, I will talk a little bit about why climate change is dangerous and what kind of values motivate us to act. Secondly, I will talk about some details and trends in our emissions and temperatures and impacts. Then I will talk about political promises and what they mean in terms of our emissions and energy consumption. And finally, I will talk about the key challenges that don't allow us to effectively mitigate climate change. And I will provide a couple of strategies or opportunities to change the situation. So I'll start with the climate change threat. This slide here shows different types of impacts that could occur due to climate change depending on the temperature increase by the end of this century relative to the pre-industrial levels. So currently we are already experiencing falling crop yields in many developing countries, the disappearance of mountain glaciers that represent important water supplies for people, ecosystem extinctions and extensive damages to coral reefs, and rising intensity of extreme weather events. Long-term impacts include decreasing food supply in developed countries, sea level rise, and multiple dangerous feedbacks that could happen in our climate systems and trigger multiple tipping points, such as shutdown of ocean circulation and melting of Greenland ice sheet. So on our current emissions path, we can reach, by the end of the century, a 4 to 6 degree temperature change. This will lead to catastrophic events. Scientists say that even 2 degree temperature change will lead to all of these events and trigger multiple tipping points. So knowing all of these impacts, the question is, what values motivate us to act? When one is a self-interest, we are concerned with things that affect us and we want to reduce those negative impacts that we can experience or our children will experience. Secondly, we have some sort of responsibility for the biosphere. We don't want to see mass extinctions. That's why we want to act to avoid those mass extinctions. And finally, we have this feeling of sense of responsibility for other humans. Rich countries, they build their wealth by burning fossil fuels, and they will be less affected by climate change than developing countries. Therefore, we may feel some sense of responsibility towards other humans in developing countries. So this slide here shows basically the share of responsibility by country in cumulative carbon emissions, and you can see that developed countries are the most responsible. And this slide here shows the impact of climate change on the world, and you can see that climate-related mortality by 2000 has been the biggest in developing countries. If all those values that are listed, self-interest, responsibility for the biosphere, responsibility for other humans, were just everything that we needed, it would be great. Solutions would be underway. Unfortunately, these values represent just prescriptions and something that humans ought to do. So, to ensure effective climate change mitigations, we have to consider human tendencies to hold beliefs that favor one's interest, that is known as self-interest, overlook inconvenient logical connections, think uncritically about misinformation, and have institutions that are unable to solve long-term problems. Therefore, if we don't incorporate these human tendencies in our decisions, all of those decisions will be just visual thinking. But before I start to talk about what we could do, I will talk a little bit more about the details. So, when we talk about emissions, we have to understand the difference between carbon emissions and carbon equivalent emissions. So when we say that the critical level of emissions is 350 parts per million of carbon emissions not to exceed the 2-degree temperature rise by the end of the century, we actually should think about the 450 parts per million target, as it includes other greenhouse gases besides carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, water vapor, and others. And we are currently on the path towards 800 parts per million of CO2 equivalent emissions by the end of the century. This is consistent with a 4 to 6 degree temperature change. And what it means is that even people who are alive today will be experiencing catastrophic events, weather events, diseases, a huge sea level rise by the end of this century. Sorry, just jumped to the end of my presentation. Sorry for that. Okay. So, as I mentioned earlier, the sea level rise will be much higher if we continue to be on our current emissions path. By the end of the century, we'll have to strengthen our protective infrastructure so that it withholds 1 extra meter of sea level rise. But we should not forget that due to multiple inertia that exists in climate systems, especially ocean inertia, that is related to the fact that ocean uptakes heat much slower than other bodies such as air. The sea level will increase by 25 to 30 meters in the long term if we increase our temperatures just by 3 degrees. These type of temperatures existed 3 million years ago, long before human evolution began. And so you can just imagine what kind of devastating impacts we would see on coastal regions. Some climate skeptics use uncertainty to justify inaction. What should be said here is that there is uncertainty of exact temperature changes, but there is high certainty in the fact that the temperature change will happen. This research that was conducted at MIT shows that under no climate policy, our temperature will increase by 4 to 6 degrees by the end of the century, whereas under global climate policy, it will be in between 2 and 4 degrees. So what do our politicians promise and what it means in terms of our energy consumption and emissions? Well, in 2009 at Copenhagen, it was decided that our temperatures should not exceed 2 degrees by the end of the century. Also, most rich countries implemented this 80% reduction target by 2050 below 2010 levels, whereas Canada implemented a target of 65% reductions. What it means is that in 18 years, by 2030, our emissions should reduce by 50%. What it also means is that any investments made today should be carbon-free. But even if we look at the target of 550 by 2000, by the end of the century, which implies only 50% chance that it will not exceed 2-degree temperature rise, our global emissions must fall by 60% by 2050. And also, if we want to achieve the 80% reduction target, it also means that developing countries should also decrease their emissions by 20% below 2010 levels. But we should not forget that as all the climate systems have a huge amount of inertia, so do energy systems. We depend on long-lasting infrastructure that supports our fossil fuel industry. We depend on our preferences. Humans have different risk perceptions associated with different technologies. There is a huge amount of inertia in energy economy systems as well. So to achieve this 550 target by the end of the century, or to achieve the drop of 60% in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, our share of carbon-free energy should increase from 15% in 2010 to 50% in 2030 and to 80% in 2050. And that share can include biomass, hydro, wind, solar, all sorts of renewables, nuclear and fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage. Our research shows that the technology exists to achieve these targets. We could make electricity generation 90% carbon-free if we use renewables, fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage, and nuclear. Buildings can be 85% emissions-free if we use heat pumps, solar, biofuels, and vehicles can be 80% free by 2050 if we use electricity, biofuel, and hydrogen. However, Canada is not really pursuing the path, pursuing this technology at the rate that is necessary to meet its targets. Moreover, Canada is heavily promoting tar sands and pipelines that emit lots of amount of carbon. So the question is government promises, are government promises consistent with what the government is actually doing? And the answer is no. And multiple independent studies show that our actions are inconsistent with our hopes and targets. So this study at MIT was focused on Canada's tar sands. So researchers modeled Canada's tar sands under a 40% CO2 reduction policy globally. And under this scenario, so it's below the targets that most rich countries implemented. Under even this policy, emissions, they don't keep below 550. So what it means is that investments in tar sands and pipelines must be stopped if Canada wants, and the rest of the world wants to achieve its targets. This study also showed that under the 40% reduction policy globally, world oil prices will remain at the same level as they are today. So what it means is that if all nations comply with and meet their commitments in terms of greenhouse gas reductions, we can meet the remaining demand by conventional oil without developing tar sands. Moreover, under this global climate policy and reduced oil demand, tar sands become profitable by 2050. This type of results have been confirmed by multiple other studies, and this is the National Roundtable on Environment and Economics basically confirms the same finding. So to achieve our targets by 2050 in Canada, we must make sure that our emissions fall right now. So you can see that they must fall by 2020, start falling by 2020. So overall, independent and government advisory research shows that Canada and the world is not on path towards 450 or 550 parts per million by 2050. And this is especially due to our aggressive promotion of tar sands and pipelines. We are currently looking on the path to 800 parts per million by 2050, which is consistent with a 4 to 6 degree temperature change. So what are the reasons why we fail to act on climate change? Well, we've had some successes with addressing the acid emissions, smoke emissions, ozone depleting emissions, and yet climate policy failure, we've seen it for more than 3 decades now. So the question is it more difficult to address climate change than other environmental problems? And we think that it is more difficult. And this is due to this reason. So first of all, climate policy making represents a type of a global public good, benefits of which are unconstrained by national boundaries, but costs are concentrated on those countries that do reduce emissions. Therefore, there is a little individual initiative to participate in global action, and everyone just waits until others start to act. And individual initiative plays a little role. So in order to ensure effective climate change mitigation, we need to have some sort of compliance and enforcement mechanism worldwide. Another reason is that while transformation costs to carbon-free systems could be low, initial costs are pretty high. Costs of building either nuclear plants, or renewable infrastructure, storage facilities, because renewables are intermittent sources. Also, there are costs associated with risks of safety, global security, if we talk about nuclear power, risks associated with how we're going to store renewable energy. Another reason is that while the costs have to be borne in the present, benefits are not very visible. And this is due to multiple uncertainties about specific impact of climate change. Although we are certain and we definitely know that the impact is dramatic, we can't predict specific impact of climate change in certain regions and predict specific benefits for certain regions. Another problem is related to a human psychology phenomenon known as loss aversion. So people value losses greater than gains. Therefore, any policies with delayed effects will be rather resented than appreciated. So any climate policies are seen as losses because effects and benefits occur in the future. And the final question, the question of equity that aligns with self-interest again, is who pays? There are multiple views on that, and there are multiple strategies, and there is a polluter pay principle, equal payment per capita or GDP, and historical responsibility method. So that's another question that usually prevents effective action on climate change. And another major challenge is self-serving bias. Humans tend to interpret climate information and climate science in the way that comforts their beliefs, their self-interest, while ignoring evidence and facts that reject those beliefs. So for oil and gas industry, it's easier to use an anti-science bias to convince people that science provides false facts and fossil fuels have actually different image. So we know that in the recent months, fossil fuel industries launched several highly funded campaigns known as clean coal, transitional national gas, ethical oil. All of those campaigns try to create an alternative image of fossil fuels and convince people that we don't need to act on climate change. And it's also easy to use and exploit an anti-establishment bias if you portray the International Panel on Climate Change as a conspiracy-like organization that makes scientists to agree on a certain agenda. It is also easy to use an anti-government bias by saying that climate policy just represents another way of excessive regulation or higher taxation or social engineering. So what could be done to make sure that all those human tendencies are addressed? Well, first of all, we should be realistic when we're designing climate policies. We should be realistic about humans and their tendency to delude themselves. we should take all these human biases into account when designing climate policies. We should also get better at communicating science and making sure that our evidence and facts that we discover is not rejected by some highly funded misinformation campaigns. So this book by Randy Olson, who came to SFU, I think in March, Don't Be Such a Scientist, provides multiple strategies how you can improve your science communication skills. And there are also many arguments against climate change action, and there are many ways to confront them. So there is an argument, what about the Chinese? Well, my supervisor asked high school students to answer this question for several years, and the answer has been always the same every single year. Rich countries should go first, thus they will lower the cost of CO2-free technologies and fuels, and if we need to ensure global compliance with climate policies, we can provide subsidies or apply trade measures. So, for example, if the United States decides to implement a cap-and-trade system and within the next decade other countries don't do anything in terms of climate policies and climate actions, the United States can require those countries to pay to trade with the United States. Another argument is that our emissions are small. So we know that Canada contributes only 2% of greenhouse gas emissions to global emissions, but we should think about numbers in a different way. All the numbers are relative. So Canada takes great pride in its contribution to World War II, when the number of troops was less than 2% of total Allied effort. So this is a relative number. Another argument is that we need economic growth and jobs. So, well, the answer to this question has been figured out by elementary school students. We know that economic growth has been used to justify harm in child labor or slavery. We should realize that high emissions growth will destroy itself. There is another argument or question: how do you tell countries that are dependent and use fossil fuels that they can't use them anymore? So, well, it's very difficult to do it. So you don't need to tell them that they can't use fossil fuels. You can tell them that they can use them in a way that will not destroy the planet. And one of those ways is to use carbon capture and storage. Another argument is that we don't need climate policy. Well, we know that corporate social responsibility as a solution will not help, because businesses ultimately compete on the basis of bottom line, and fossil fuels are still cheap. Green consumerism is also not a solution, because we all consume energy at some stage. Doesn't matter how much we recycle, how much we buy. Energy efficiency is thought to be cheap, but it's still cheaper to burn fossil fuels. Also, we should realize that people have different preferences and risk perceptions associated with purchasing energy-efficient technologies. Some people don't want to purchase energy-efficient technologies either because they're scared of them or they don't trust them. There is also an idea that carbon neutrality or carbon offsets can be a solution, but carbon offsets give a wrong, false sense of progress. We buy or sell carbon offsets, but they still continue to emit greenhouse gas emissions. Also, very frequently, carbon offsets pay people for certain actions that people were going to take anyway. So this is known as a free ridership effect, or So this is something that's related with the carbon offsets and subsidies as well. And another argument is that peak oil and higher energy prices will help to solve the climate change issue. Well, we know that the Earth's crust has lots of fossil fuels, and humans are very innovative. They keep inventing ways to extract fossil fuels all the time. So this table shows that this is the amount of oil that we consumed in 2009, and this is the amount of oil that we know exists in the Earth's crust, and it's known as reserves. But we don't know yet how to extract that oil. This is the amount of gas we consumed in 2009, and this is the amount of gas that is available in the Earth's crust. And this is the amount of coal that we know how to extract. So there is a plenitude of fossil fuels, and high energy prices will not help to solve the climate change issue. So another argument is that climate policy can't work. And yes, we have about 20 years of experience showing that information and subsidy programs don't work. We know that emissions pricing is working in certain countries such as Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. But it's economically efficient, but unfortunately politically unacceptable, especially in North America. Regulations have, we've had some success with the regulations in the past. They phased out acid emissions, acid rain emissions, smoke, ozone depleting emissions. So one idea could be to design regulations and emissions pricing tools so that they are efficient. And examples include BC's carbon tax and BC's zero emissions electricity policy. And finally, what about us as citizens? If we know that, if the evidence shows that the government is lying, what should we do as citizens? So some options could include public relation campaigns, social networking campaigns, boycotts, stopping high emissions projects through legal action, and participating in non-violent civil actions. Thank you for your attention. Any questions?
So are you leading any campaigns or anything like that? Or?
No, we are not leading any campaigns, but if you know maybe that Mark Jagger participated in this clean calls and he stopped the train and he was arrested. Yeah, but it seems that that's the only one way how we can cause the change.
We're meeting again to stop some more trains. Anybody interested? I was paddy wagon with Mark. Mark's fun.
Yeah.
So on the very last slide, you sort of went very quickly through what the alternative actions were if the government won't act, including things like social networking campaigns. But that, I guess maybe I'm not clear on what exactly you mean by, can you be more specific about what a social networking campaign is?
Yeah, I guess.
So, like specifically there's this pipeline that they're considering expanding at the base of the mountain. So with respect to that, what does a social networking campaign look like?
Yeah, I'm honestly not an expert in these type of things, but I think what is meant here is that like any types of campaigns that can get people together, either through Facebook or any other ways of just organizing people and bringing them together. One other thing that is mentioned here is that use popular culture. So if we have people who are famous and who have some sort of role, play some sort of they have some image for the society at large, those people can influence the rest of the general public to take actions. Yeah, I'm not an expert in these type of things, but that's